Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a changing America. I'm Jonny Coker. New Mexico is approaching the height of wildfire season. Rising temperatures and prolonged drought exacerbate wildfire severity and put private property at risk. And extinguishing blazes in remote wilderness areas can be a complex and difficult task. I have more in this report. As summers become drier and hotter in New Mexico, the state's national forests become more vulnerable. In recent weeks, crews have been battling the Blue fire, which was caused by a lightning strike in the White Mountain Wilderness. Red flag conditions transformed what was a small blaze into a large fire that posed a threat to communities in the area. Galen Farrington lives in Alto, New Mexico, one of the areas placed on high alert as the Blue fire swept through the mountain. His community sits at the edge of an old burn scar, and he's been ordered to evacuate multiple times over the years due to the presence of wildfires. Farrington expressed frustration with authorities for letting the Blue fire grow to the point of threatening homes.
It just so happened I was at the county commissioner meeting when the hotshots were presenting their case to allow the fire to burn. And I got to see the video of the half-acre fire. And I suggested to the hotshot, why don't you just simply drop a bucket of water on this thing? Looks like two guys with a fire hose could put this out. And he explained that it's not quite as simple as that when it comes to wilderness areas.
Over a decade ago, the Little Bear Fire burned tens of thousands of acres in this exact area, along with hundreds of properties. And the overarching question for people that still live in this area is, how was the Blue fire allowed to get out of control in the way that it has? And what can be done in the future to prevent this type of thing from happening again? Now, according to Forest Service officials, the lightning strike that caused the Blue fire was completely within the designated White Mountain Wilderness and in terrain too difficult to be reached by fire crews, which is what led to it growing to the level that it has. But Farrington wasn't satisfied with that explanation.
All of us feel that these people are experts. We have entrusted within them the ability to act in our best interest as a community. And after I heard the explanation as to why we don't need to put out this fire, I thought to myself, this is a confluence of conditions that's going to recreate the Little Bear Fire.
New Mexico has yet to reach the peak of wildfire season, yet the state has already experienced multiple non-prescribed wildfires that have burned thousands of acres. It's a stark reminder of the challenges faced by both firefighters and local communities as they navigate the complexities of forestry management. Down the street from Alto, authorities moved into the Ruidoso High School to be used as a command post for the Blue fire. Loretta Benavides, Public Information Officer for the Forest Service, said she understands frustration coming from distressed residents, but said she has confidence in her team to make the right decisions when faced with difficult circumstances.
All of these experts that come together to form this team have extensive knowledge about what firefighting is about. They have grown up from boots on the ground to these very high positions to understand the science of fire, to understand how it moves, why it moves, where. And then they're also engaged in communities, in providing public education whenever they can. Sometimes, though, communities are not necessarily receptive unless there's a threat. And we do move forward with a set of emotions that says, we don't want this to happen, we don't want that to happen, or we don't want, some other instance to occur that's going to result in serious injury, fatality, damage to residents. We never want that to happen.
According to Douglas Cram, a forestry and fire ecology expert at New Mexico State University, putting out every fire as soon as it appears is not only unrealistic, but it's also not advisable.
We're not going back to the days of suppressing every fire as fast as humanly possible. In some cases, they can burn and have ecological benefit. And again, like in this case, it's burning in a fire footprint. These systems are historically adapted to fire, and you can't keep fire out of them. We like to change the fuel structure, so we have stands that are more resilient to fire, change fire behavior, but there's certainly not going to be no fire in these stands. The idea of putting a fire out immediately or letting it burn and how big it gets, I mean, sometimes you can dictate that, other times you can't.
And while climate change continues to drive instances of fire weather, Cram explained that the solution to severe wildfires is to mitigate damage with the right type of management, including thinning and prescribed burns.
I think it's a sign of the times. This idea that this fire is burning in an old footprint is, we're going to see more and more of that across the state. We have some large footprints from high severity fires, and fire promotes fire. I mentioned those other natural disasters, you can't do anything about those. Whereas with fire, between changing fuel loads and changing mindsets and fuel loads on your own property, it can actually work pretty well.
As the state braces for the height of wildfire season, communities like Alto grapple with the evolution of modern wildfire management, highlighting the tension between immediate suppression and long-term ecological benefit. And now joining me is Dr. Doug Cram, NMSU's Extension Forest and Fire Specialist. Doug, thanks so much for being on the program today.
Johnny, it's good to be here.
Absolutely. So let's just get right into it. How long have you been at NMSU, and how long have you been studying wildfire science?
The two are similar. I've been at NMSU about 22 years and have about 3 or 4 more years of graduate school before that studying forestry and fire science.
Definitely. And so what got you into fire science? What made you want to pursue this as a field of study?
The story I like to tell is I grew up in Los Alamos, so that's probably relevant to this story, thinking about the Cerro Grande fire in 2000. But I grew up, it's a beautiful landscape up there, spent time outside and scouting, and sort of propelled me to look for a job outside. So actually when I came down here to NMSU, did a wildlife undergrad, and then went on to a forestry and range degrees at Oklahoma State, and then back here for a doctorate. So all those just, again, starting outside, but really with an interest in forestry and fire, developing from, again, growing up in Los Alamos.
And so you do have a lot of hours within this field. Tell me about the boots on the ground stage and being a part of prescribed wildfires. What does that do to evolve your understanding about forest ecology and what happens within forests when fires do burn through areas?
Fortunately, I think I really don't have a whole lot of wildland boots on the ground experience. That's wildland firefighters. But my experience really started on the prescribed fire side. And so that's sort of a boots on the ground as well. Started in Oklahoma State in a graduate degree, doing rangeland and mixed hardwood forests in southeastern Oklahoma, and then came here to New Mexico and continued forest and range burning. So usually as a burn boss, and we've over the last basically 10 years, we've done more what we call learn and burns, hook up with landowners and do a burn on their property, and invite all the neighbors and have them make it an educational experience using prescribed fire to show how it works and the ecological impacts.
Tell me about that learn and burn. I mean, how do people get involved with this type of thing, and what exactly is that program?
Most of our interactions have come through, since I'm in Extension, landowners talk to their county agent, which of course we have an agent in every single county, and they may express, I'm really interested in burning, but I don't have much experience. In the state, unlike say Oklahoma or the Southeast, where they've been burning for years, that sort of knowledge base isn't necessarily here with our landowners on a large scale. So again, they might contact the county agent, and they know of my expertise, and so we'll go out there to the ranch or forest plot and see what they have, and see what they want to accomplish. That's always the first step is what are your objectives? Can we achieve that with fire? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes no, and then we start write a burn plan, involve the landowners, try to educate them in every step of the process. And eventually we pick a date and invite the neighbors out and conduct a burn.
In what situations are these burns beneficial to the land and to the property owners? Like what is the perfect scenario for prescribed burns, I suppose?
Well, again, my background is in the science side as well as extension, and so we know that in the Southwest, our forests are fire-dependent forests. That means high frequency, low severity historically. That would be over the last 10,000 years. So we know we have this basis for fire, and that applies for rangelands and forest plots. So that's kind of the basis. And then, a story that's been told many times is basically over the last, let's just say 100 years, since about 1910, we've had this era of policy of suppression and exclusion. And so in that time period, all these fuels built up, again, in rangelands or forests. And then certainly, again, sort of Cerro Grande being this baptism by fire over the last 24 years, we've got this fire environment where we have frequent high severity wildland fires. So trying to roll that back is where prescribed fire comes into that. So it's sort of a natural fit to, again, reintroducing fire in the landscape.
Mm. And you've been studying within this field for, like you said, over 20 years now. Just in your time, how has the science changed? And do you feel like we're where we need to be in terms of the understanding of where our forests need to be in terms of letting healthy fires burn through and being able to deal with forests in that way? How has the science evolved since you've been in the field?
When I came in, a lot of what we rely on is dendrochronology, a lot of the great work out of Tucson, the Tree Ring Laboratory. And so that's really given us this great picture that we couldn't have otherwise had going back 300, 500 years. Again, looking at the frequency, and you can also tell severity of wildland fires. So that we just continued to add more and more knowledge to that. And that's kind of played a significant role when we've had two off the top of my head, right? Cerro Grande and the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, right? With these two prescribed burns that escaped and caused significant destruction and damage. And so, but the fire management agencies has basically relied on the science to say, look, these incidents are definitely unfortunate and we can do better, but we know we're on the right track. This really deep sense of research helps us understand that these forests, again, do need fire. So that fire is, well, that's science. We continue to learn more, but the general idea of frequent forests that burn frequently is sort of established.
Mm. And so for viewers and listeners that may not know the importance of fire in forest, why is that tactic of full suppression for every single fire, why is that a bad thing, and what does that lead to?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing. Just if every single fire is full suppression, right? Then we tried that basically, and we don't need to have a model to see how that looks. We walk out in our forests in the Southwest and see that. Again, this idea of every single fire that started, even if it's on a mild weather day and we've had a great winter, we put them all out. And again, over this course of, again, I'm just saying 100 years, and this fuel buildup, that's really hard to undo that in a day or two or a month. So, we've continued to put fire back in these systems.
Mm. And so what do these high severity fires, I assume it's better to have lower severity fires that burn a little colder and don't completely destroy everything on their way through. So what happens when those high severity fires do happen and they do obliterate everything in their path? What does that do to the mountain and to the forest that it happens to?
One thing I may have skipped over, fire is a natural part of these systems, and we're not trying to remove all fire. That wouldn't work. And when I say all fire, for example, we talked about, you mentioned, cold fires. We think of them as low, moderate, and high severity. And so historically, again, mostly low and moderate severity fires, again, over the last 10,000 years. But over, let's say, the last 24 years, we've seen these larger and larger high severity, contiguous acre wildland fires that, especially in our forests, are crown fires. And so that is definitely not normal or natural in these systems. And of course, many folks in New Mexico know now, because these footprints, because it's in your backyard, these footprints have gotten larger. And you end up with, basically this bare patch of ground, which is unfortunate, but really the lingering problem is that over the next 3 years for sure, and 5, every time it rains, there's a threat of flood and debris flow. And if the fire wasn't destructive or disruptive enough, these flood events are less, less able to prepare for and plan for, and it's really difficult for these communities that have, again, it's not just the fire, but 3 years, 5 years following, trying to deal with these flood and debris flow events.
Mm. And you use that phrase, the crowning fires or crown fire. What exactly does that mean, and why is that a bad thing?
In small acres, let's say a 10-patch crown fire wouldn't necessarily be a big deal. That probably happened historically, right? Maybe in a north aspect, in a dry year. But again, when it's tens of thousands of contiguous acres in what we call the tree canopy, so we call that the crown, right? So just moving through that crown kills all trees, all ages, diameter classes. It's really pretty much impossible to stop until the weather changes. So it's ecologically, it's, again, on those scales is not normal. It's pretty destructive to the forest. You kind of end up with a brushland instead. And of course, for firefighters, it's pretty dangerous in communities. So, when it's a crown fire, it's just really disruptive.
Mm. And a lot of individuals, especially once the fires start threatening their homes and their properties, people get really emotional about this subject. So, and during the Blue 2 fire, I spoke with communities that were right on the edge of that fire. They were under evacuation orders, and they've been under evacuation orders, multiple times in the past. And they were very critical of the official response and for letting the fires get to the point where they were threatening properties. So what would your message be to folks that are in that position that feel like not enough is being done to preserve their homes, basically?
Yeah, from a 10,000-foot perspective, having not been on that fire or in sort of the decision room where those decisions are being made, or understanding how the decisions were communicated out, these are all natural disasters, and there's no script ever as to know how to proceed or know how it will play out. And so I sort of fall back on this idea of you and I visited about this idea of learning to live with fire. We have had these fire environments. We're going to have fire one way or the other. And so in some cases where we can allow these fires to perform their ecological functions, then these fire management agencies have been doing that to varying degrees, let's say over the last 20 or 30 years. But there's been more emphasis on that over the last, again, 10 and 20 years, again, seeing that these fires and the way they burn are part of these systems, and where we can allow them to burn, they do. It seems like about 2017, we got about 55,000 acres of, let's call it fire use fire. Again, that's burning at mostly low, maybe some moderate fire behavior. And that's, again, next time there's a wildland fire on those acres, it will be less severe. So maybe instead of high severities and moderate, it's mostly low. So again, on the Blue fire, we're all have a lot of emotion invested in, hey, nobody wants to lose their home, their property, their neighborhood. And there's a tendency to say, hey, let's just put these fires out immediately. But again, we've tried that. And so the agencies actually have a lot of tools and experience in trying to make that decision. And there's never any guarantee as to how it might go. You may allow it to burn, and it may go great for 2 or 3 weeks, and then there's a wind event that you couldn't see. Now we can't see 3 weeks ahead of time. And, maybe we get some higher severity fire or worse that it wasn't desired, but that's just part of living in New Mexico. Again, we've tried suppressing all fire, and that hasn't worked sort of ecologically or socially.
I see. And so essentially, what is the best way for individuals to prepare for fire? Because I know you host a webinar series every spring. You have told, in our previous conversations, you talked about, it's hard to prepare for earthquakes, it's hard to prepare for tornadoes, but with wildfires, there's something we can actively be doing. So can we just start there? What can individuals be doing to protect themselves from fires and from keeping their property safe and their neighborhood safe?
You bet. As we kind of alluded to, almost the first step is to sort of acknowledge, hey, I live in this fire environment. And so as I sort of, jokingly say, if you don't like fires, hey, go to Florida, right? Hey, Doug, I don't like hurricanes. Well, you can go to Oklahoma, but I don't like earthquakes. Pardon me, tornadoes. You can go to California, I don't like earthquakes. So come back to New Mexico and sort of embrace fire, right? We can actually, unlike those other natural disasters, we can change the fuel load and change the way fire behaves. So the first step is really understanding, acknowledging, hey, this is fire environment. Some people have more of a fire danger. We know there's this fire actually burning in Ruidoso right now. That's one of the biggest hot spots in New Mexico is Cloudcroft and Ruidoso. So understanding the environment you live in, sort of, if you will, accepting that, acknowledging that is a step one. And then I like to start with the individual or the family unit, a home, because even before you think about your home, you can, as a family, you can be prepared for a wildland fire. In fact, our series talks about that. We just put out a publication here on evacuations and being not only how to evacuate, but to be prepared before that comes. So again, some individual family preparations. After that, certainly your home. There's techniques you can do to make your home more fire-wise. We'll talk more about that. And then your yard as well. And then hopefully, your neighborhood. So collectively between your home, your yard, and your neighborhood, you can be pretty well prepared for wildland fire. Again, there's no guarantees, but that will get you pretty far down the road. And again, another looking forward, the insurance industry is really under uncharted waters right now because of all these disasters across the country. And I just talked to a friend over in Arizona who's an agent, and he's got, for example, homes up in the Mount Lemmon, $20,000 for a home, which is pretty much like, forget it, I'm not going to have insurance. So we don't want to get there and maybe going there, but the more individuals and communities and neighborhoods can sort of be proactive and try and mitigate these fire risks, that may help the insurance industry and collectively all of us to avoid, whatever may come in that industry.
Interesting. Something that you said actually that just piqued my interest was you said that Ruidoso and Cloudcroft are some of the hottest spots for fires. Is that because of the villages and being in those areas and having a history of immediate suppression, or what made you say that?
It's mostly just the risk, right? You involve, it's a density of people, homes, fuel loading, topography. Certainly, pretty much if you look at a map of New Mexico, any forested landscape is sort of red, if you will, in terms of risk for wildland fire. But again, you have a number of people, infrastructure, in Ruidoso for sure. Cloudcroft seems like it's just been dodging bullets for the last couple of years. So, but again, even if you're a small community in New Mexico in a forest situation, the risk is still high.
And so I want to ask about, potential policy changes, whether it's at the national level or the state level. Do you think New Mexico is at a good place in terms of, having politicians on board with what our agencies are doing? And do you think there's anything that could be done to help bolster, these agencies that deal with forest fires and prevent them?
Yeah. On a side note, right? We're not trying to prevent fires. We're trying to change their behavior. So that's, and also, while we're on that kind of idea, sometimes the first report is how big the fire is.
Right.
As a fire ecologist, I'm not worried about the size of a fire. I'm worried about how it's behaving. Is it low and moderate fire? What's the fuel moisture? What are the fuel conditions? We could have a 100,000 acre wildfire that's low and moderate behavior that's doing great things. So in terms of policy, again, over the last 24 years, because of these two big fires and others, our lawmakers are well aware of the fire issues, and our residents are as well. So one example of a recent policy is in about 2021, New Mexico passed their new Prescribed Burning Act. And directly to address this issue of trying to reduce fuel loads for private landowners in a more accessible way. And so that is an example of a great policy change. I like to tell a story in Florida and Georgia, for example. Over 25 years, they had to go to the legislature 5 times to get the policy where they wanted it. And so whatever our policy is, prescribed fire, forest thinning and burning, insurance, policies, we have the expertise, the knowledge to keep making improvements, but it tends to take time.
Yeah, and this will be my last question. How do you feel with where New Mexico is at as a state? would you yourself move to the forest, or as climate change gets worse and as our days get hotter and drier and the drought continues, is it even advisable to live in these places? Because they are beautiful, and I grew up there, and you grew up in the mountains of New Mexico, but is this something that is fleeting away from us is one day all of our mountains going to be burned, or do we just need to stay resilient and stay with the science and keep our eyes out?
Going back to Los Alamos, it can be a little bit, honestly, depressing maybe to go up and see where you had this high severity fire in Cerro Grande, and then about 10, 11 years later, Los Conchas burned again. And there were some areas up there in the mountains that didn't burn the first time, and so you have sort of this refuge of trees that you're like, great, that's where we can start building the forests again. But the next fire was also a crown fire, and it took out those refugia. So there's some concern that these forest environments might shift into these brushlands. And so that is kind of discouraging. My colleagues up in Mora, just in teaming up with Highlands and state forestry and legislatures, have just passed some legislation to get a seedling nursery for seedlings for these to grow more trees on these forests, right? And so right now they're growing like 300,000 seedlings, and they need about 5 million. So that you can understand the order of magnitude there. So, we don't really have a choice, right? Nobody's necessarily leaving. We love this country, this again, New Mexico, arid lands, and our forests and watersheds. So they need our attention, and it's sort of a collective effort between the homeowners, scientists, extension, agencies working together to make these sites more resilient. There's going to be fire on there. We just want to change the way that fire looks and behaves. And so I think eventually we'll get there, maybe over the next 100 years or 1,000 years, but we'll get there.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much for being here today, Dr. Doug Cram. We're out of time, unfortunately, but it's great to have someone on the program to speak about this issue and to help us navigate it. So thanks for being on today's program.
You bet. Thanks, Johnny.
That's all for today's episode. Remember, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Fronteras, A Changing America.